Hey, Destiny.
Hey Lee, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, just a lot going on in my life, but it is all good things, and I'm glad that the sun was out today because it's been kind of gloomy lately.
Yeah, I'm not home. So the sun has been on and off here, but when it's been here, it's been great. So I definitely understand how you feel about the sun, and especially its energy that it brings.
Yeah, love a
Changes your
good
mood. Yeah.
bright day like in the 70s. Like that's a good day.
hmm
Um, but yeah, it's good to see you. And I wanted to first, before we get started with our amazing guest that we'll bring on, but I did want to just throw out there that Unbound is doing a series called Queering the Family. And one of the reasons why we did this series is because a lot of focus goes on Mother's Day and Father's Day during this time of the year. And families look very different. There are many manifestations of family, and focusing on just that binary can be problematic. So we're not dismissing moms and dads out there,
Of course
but
not.
we're just expanding our ideas of what family means and what family can look like. So
Where can
check
they
that
find
out.
that, Lee?
You can find that at justiceunbound.org, and you can click on the Queering the Family link at the top, or it's on the main page. But you can find it on social media, and we've been partnering with More Light Presbyterians, who are also doing a Bible study live on Tuesday with some of the authors from Queering the Family. So check that out
Hmm.
on their social media. So I'm really excited about that. And we're expanding the family, y'all. We're not just gonna stick in this binary. So yeah. So with that, should we welcome our guest?
Yes, let's do it.
Welcome, guest. Hello.
Hey, y'all.
Hello. Hey.
We are so excited you are here with us to have part two of our conversation. But before we dive deep, we just want you to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourself, what context you're coming from when you're talking, things that people should know, the viewers who are watching, and maybe Lee and I, so that way it can bring out some of the questions when we discuss and help along this dialogue. And I'm going to ask Irene to go first since Rev Ray is a returning guest. I'm so happy that you're here. But Irene, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be here. I'm really excited. My name is Irene Cho. I am a recent transplant to the East Bay area. I just moved to Oakland from Los Angeles after being in LA for 30 years. But I did grow up in the East Coast, so I still consider myself an East Coast baby and an East Coast snob. So in particular, New York and Philly area. So Lee, I know you were saying, you just talked to your mom, so your accent's a little bit harder. When I go back to Philly, I mean, be with family, I'll start talking like this all the time, like, and just come back real hardcore. Or if I'm tired, it's just like all the filters drop and my accent comes out. So I'm really excited though to share that I'm starting a new endeavor. I've been in youth ministry for, really long time. 20 some plus years. I'm not going to add the sum what it is. But yeah, I'm starting a new endeavor. It's called the In Between. We're wanting to be a training and resourcing organization, in particular for those who are decolonizing their faith and theology and moving from evangelical to post-evangelical, and really believing that the deepest transformational growth happens in the in-between space, but it's also the most difficult space for folks to be in. And so we're wanting to provide classes, cohorts, curricula, all types of things. So just launched that out. I'm going to launch out a new cohort for a certificate program for leaders who are serving in particularly what we had coined as urban. I know that that terminology is transitioning a lot, but under-resourced, served, marginalized communities, but not necessarily from the very evangelical perspective, which is most of what certification training is. And so just wanting to provide a whole certificate that gives a foundational training for any leaders who are serving in those types of communities. Yeah, so excited about what this new, this new adventure, which is really freaky and scary, but really exciting at the same time.
Nice. And before I kick it over to Rev Ray, just want to give you a shout out. Yes, East Coast people. I'm from Pennsylvania, so
Yeah.
glad to have another East Coaster in the house. And Rev Ray.
Oh.
Thanks. You have a third East Coaster as well. Actually, I guess Lee's also from the East Coast too. So yeah, I'm originally from Jersey and from Boston. So those are my places of origin. But now I'm in Los Angeles, where Irene just left. That is so awesome. I'm so excited to hear this new start, Irene. I'm definitely going to take classes with you. I'm excited about that. So definitely, I love your work, and I always have found you amazing, an amazing partner in this justice work. So go, Irene. Glad to have you on here with me. So about me, I was here the last time with you all with the first part of Stop AAPI Hate. But just again, I am a teaching elder here in the Presbyterian Church. I'm here in Los Angeles and a community organizer. I currently work as an organizer with Clergy for Black Lives and with Third World Power, which is an organizing group for non-Black people of color who work with BLMLA, Black Lives Matter. And so that's my primary area of organizing. I also do a lot of the social justice work with our local presbytery here, or presbyteries actually. And I also am a mom of 2 kids, 6 and 8. And speaking about creating families, I am a single mom of 2 kids. I'm divorced, and we don't often talk a lot about that. So that's a part of my story and a part of my identity. What else can I share? I have a new dog. That's probably the newest news in my life right now. So, and I am actually in the process of a church start. And it's similar to something like a dinner church. So where we meet and gather in homes for dinner, and there's contemplative prayer involved and stuff like that. So that's kind of a new endeavor. So anyway, thank you for inviting me again. I'm excited to talk about this really important conversation. It is, I think, a really important conversation that we have not really taken seriously in our country for a long time, and certainly taken seriously in the church, while the AAPI community is actually one of the largest growing, particularly in our denomination. And so that's, I'm excited that we're lifting this up and able to talk about it directly.
Yeah, and so Irene wrote a piece about the intersection of the AAPI community and gender, and specifically when it comes to AAPI women and the fetishization of Asian women, and how that all intersects with the increasing in hate crimes towards our AAPI siblings. And so this evening, we hope to focus on that a little more, because the murders that happened in Atlanta, that this conversation wraps around those events. And last week we had a conversation about purity culture, which also wrapped around that event. And so I wonder, taking from what we did last week about purity culture and speaking about the hate we've seen toward many Asian women, what are those intersections that we've seen, both in history and in the now? Because I know it's not a new thing. So I wonder if we can start there and then see where it goes.
Yeah, the Atlanta shooting, which was a bit unique, separate from the other violence we've been seeing happening, in particular the Bay Area, where we're seeing so many of our elderly Asian, grandparents and older parents getting attacked, you know, by the confession of the shooter, you know, who went declaring because he wanted to be cleansed, etc. The piece that I wrote really wanted to name the fact of something that we don't talk about a lot. And it was something from my own personal journey as well. Like, you know, I'm an older Asian American second gen kid. And so, you know, my parents immigrated here and I was born here. And so I don't know any other home except for the United States. And yet there was so much, in particular, growing up in the East Coast, you know, in New York, especially with Scarsdale, which was very heavily Jewish, very heavily white. I was like 1 in 4 kids from, it was a middle school through high school, you know, school. And so, you know, there was a lot of pressure, especially in middle school, where I look like I'm still 8 years old, right? It's like Asians, and everyone told me, okay, it's going to be fantastic, you know, when you get older that you look younger, and it so totally is, but it really sucks when you're young and everyone's developing and growing, and I look like I'm still 8 and can go in the kids' price to Disneyland, right? It's just not fun at all. And so you're trying to assimilate into this culture and society and be a woman, and like, what does that mean? You know, and as I began to get older, and white men in particular started to give me accolades and pay attention to me, you know, I didn't know, and at that time frame, we didn't really talk about what it meant to be exotified and what it meant to be fetishized, right? And so, you know, I'm thinking this is great. You know, I'm getting attention. I'm feeling very, you know, good about my self-esteem, all of that. Which, even growing up in a Christian environment as a church kid, you know, it's like this weird dichotomy that is completely separate between my sexual identity and my whole personhood identity versus, you know, my Christian identity and my pure identity of like the virginization of who I am, like the good that I am eligible, a great candidate, solid candidate to be a good wife, a good Christian wife, you know, all of that. I didn't really understand how to intersect that, as, you know, in my own personal journey, et cetera. And as I continue to dive into racial issues and really, you know, explore and get educated on this, I began to understand, oh, exotification is bad. Like, you know, fetishization may be a temporary boosting thing that I might feel, and yet, you know, in actuality, in the long run, it's super harmful, right? In the way that we as Asian women, although when you look at all the dating apps, you know, there was some research done about 10 years ago that came out. I forget which dating app it was, that was like the top 2, you know, most sought after ethnicity or racial groups was white men and Asian women, right? And there was a lot of dialogue that happened around that, et cetera. And so, you know, on the one hand, as, you know, people tend to try to place the suffering Olympics and do comparisons of oppression, you know, they're like, okay, well, Asian women, we have it easy, we're so desired, all these things. Yet we have not very much addressed the demons on that underbelly, which is this continued forever othering, this continued ever thought that we are something to be owned, to be commodified, to be ruled over, we're like trophies, something that's a prized possession, and it's not at all actually healthy and honoring to our identity. And so when the Atlanta shooting happened, and this poor kid who, this young gentleman who really, I mean, the church, there's so many layers to his story of what we're talking about, demanded or felt that we as Asian women were obligated to cleanse him and purify him, and therefore, or rather we were dirtying him, and therefore he had to murder in order to cleanse himself and be free, right? It's just this very dark element that we don't talk about as we talk about racial issues a lot. And so, and I wanted to share in my piece about a lot of dialogue I have with white folks, which is, well, you need to shut up because you're an Asian woman. What do you know of like racial issues? What do you know of problems? You don't know anything. You're super hyper privileged. You're just as privileged as white folks. You need to sit down. And it's a really necessary topic for us to dialogue. And I don't say that as saying I understand fully the plight of, what Black folks are going through and Indigenous folks are going through, in particular Black women, at all. And again, nobody wins in the oppression Olympics, right? And so how can we all name all the darkness and all the repercussions that come? Because even if there are elements by which Asian women have certain elements of privilege, there's a dark, very huge underside to that, which we saw come out in the Atlanta shooting. And so my piece, I really wanted to share to white folks in particular. I know on the initial shallow front, it might seem like exotification, is really good and something wonderful. And yet, in actuality, it's super harmful to not just Asian women, but to all of us as humans, because any sort of othering of each other just basically degrades our humanity of one another, right? And so, yeah.
Did you want to respond, Ray?
Yeah, sure. I really appreciate what Irene is lifting up here. And I think what it makes me think of is the fact, what are the implications of our Christian theology because of racism and how it's colored our ability to see others, right? And so, for example, if we're talking about, what is causing me to sin, right? And then you link, okay, well, it becomes a person or a people group, right? And so, for example, and this is why I think our relationship and the challenges that we as Asian American women and Asian Americans in general, and Pacific Islanders face in general. And by the way, I just want to name that there is a conversation happening about the differences between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, because the issues that we face are very different. And it's the same way that when you talk about Latinos and Latinas and Latinxs, right? Like there's such variety and variation in our groups. And so I just want to be able to name that there. I don't know if we'll have time to really dig into that. I feel like it's also worth maybe in the future, if you want to continue the conversation, to invite people with who are Pacific Islander and to be able to share their story and sort of how they see their identity and its placement and how racism participates in their lives. But I'll put that on the side for a moment there and just say that to return back to sort of the reason that we have such a link between the experiences of racism between at least Asian Americans and our Black kin is because of the fact that we are constantly being placed into a theology, into a location in our theology that we have not asked for. And so we never have our own agency in being able to be fully human and part of God's full, divine, perfect creation, right? And so I'm going to take it a little bit further, right? So for example, we all have heard now probably in the news that oftentimes when we talk about what is sin, we tend to think of and name, right? When you're in Sunday school and youth group, right? You often say white is pure, and we often say Black is sinful or somehow, bad or wrong or dirtied, right? And so immediately those are now how we determine and think about how we see other people. In the same way, right? When we talk about sexual sin and sexual purity and all those things, because again of racism and how women have been in particular, but Asian women also, specifically in a number of wars where we've become these exoticized, fetishized slaves to be sexually conquered, and we are these sort of the thing that you win if you win a war, the thing that you win if you win a battle. Then that now is an overlaying of what we read in the biblical text. And so it's now our theology, right, is being colored by our racism. instead of actually understanding the divine sort of truth that God is trying to sort of speak to us, right? Which is one about love, right? One about justice, one about, what is actually sin, right? Which is when, my version, right, is when I have a break with my relationship with God and with others and with creation. And so there is an opportunity, I feel like, as we discuss racism and its relationship to theology, to begin seeing how our theology needs to be dismantled and to be sort of reimagined, to see something new, and to really understand how the Spirit is speaking to us now in this moment, to uncover those ways by which Christianity has participated. Christianity has and still continues to participate in subjugating groups of people because of our gender, sexuality, our race, our ethnicity, etc. So that was a lot there, and I don't know how, but I would love to hear sort of other comments and your thoughts on that, Irene and Destiny and Lee.
You got some, Destiny?
I do, but this is not about us. So, but I will say, I just wanted to point out, thank you for naming and saying, like, the separations and not clumping a group of people all together. I know people do that actually with every ethnicity, especially the Latinx community and Latinas are two different things. And thank you for naming that. But no, I'm not going to divulge into that. But I will ask if Irene doesn't have anything to say. Ray, our show, and you're not new, but Irene, we like to think that Just Talk Live listeners are learning about these topics or hearing about them just for the first time. And we're throwing some pretty big social justice words around. So in your best definition, doesn't have to be anything pretty out the Webster Dictionary or, pull it from Theology Handbook, just your best interpretation of it. What is fetishization and exotication? Your best two definitions of that, just so that way the listeners can know what exactly you all are talking about or coming from when you're saying those words.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we talk sexually, they're a little bit different in the sense that, like, to be fetishized is more of a sexual inclination, right? And so they have, people have an inkling, a fantasy, that kind of thing by which it would lean towards some sort of sexual conquest, all of that, versus exotification, which doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, have to do with a sexual innuendo in it. So, like we saw with Yoon Yajung, I call her Ajma because she's my auntie, that we saw at the Academy Awards, everyone during her speech was, they panned over to, I don't remember which white actress it was, and they were just like, she's so adorable, and she's like a little doll, and I want to take her home, and she's so cute, and there's this exotified type of thing, again, of this like othering, something that is foreign, something that is, not American. And we see this all the time when Asian Americans like myself, who have a full-blown white accent, right? I don't have any other dialect. There's nothing, as we call Fabi, of my accent by which would make any indications that I am not from this country. I'm not from LA because, again, I could say things that are like Philadelphian or whatever. But I will be asked, even though I am born here and can be president of the United States, well, where are you from? No, where are you really from, right? And I was just talking to somebody, in this one other group that educates white folks, and we were talking about that whole element by which, Chinese Americans have been here for 5 generations. The 45 he's only a 3rd generation German person, right? His daddy was 2nd gen, and his grandfather came over here on the boats. Okay, so like there are Chinese Americans here who are more American than number 45 who just got booted out, right? I refuse to say his name. So, but we don't talk about that. You don't see folks going up to, white people and being like, no, where are you really from? And like going up to white folks randomly and saying things like ciao and, whatever, like bonjour. I don't go up to white people like people come up to me saying ni hao and like, konnichiwa and like all the gross things, right? So that's exotification, by which you're continually othering, and again, it sounds like a certain element that you're putting these people on a pedestal or that culture on a pedestal, but it's very dehumanizing in that sense, right? And so, but there's a little bit of an overlap in that, but yet the distinction, in my opinion, is the sexual innuendo with the fetishization, that piece that comes in, by which you have a thing. I mean, I've been told by men like, oh, I have a thing for Asians. I'm like, cool. I don't have a thing for jerks, so move along, and there's so many Asian women that get told that they have a kink for Asian women. They have all these things by which you want to say that.
Yeah, and that's the conversation. I mean, and that kind of links to the conversation we had last week about, and the church definitely doesn't talk about that like this. The church doesn't talk about like this fetishization in ways that really speaks to like the sin of it. Like they speak to the sexualized part. That's the sin. Like the sex part is the sinful part, but like the degradation and the dehumanization, we just kind of ignored that part. And so that was very interesting. And Ray, I wonder how that's connected to these definitions as well. This idea that the church only speaks toward like sex as it's. I wonder what you may think about that relationship, because it is very to kind of unpack that a little bit, because it is a very nuanced thing.
And I do want to say for the record that I'm not saying fetishization of something. Like if you're into feet, or if you're into food on your body, or whatever kink you have, I don't want to demonize anything and elevate purity culture by shaming somebody who has some sort of fetish of something. It's just the issue we're talking about here, I want to be very clear and specific, is the dehumanization by which you fetishize a certain people group, right? And so making it that people group, again, is something to be owned or commodified or controlled or obtained, or, like anything that is very colonizing in your mindset, which is, so it's important that we distinguish that. I don't want to shame anyone who's like super into wearing clear heels while, you're having sex. Go at it. Like, you do you, right? Like, I don't want to demonize anything on that level, because I don't want to encourage the grossness that is purity culture.
I think a way that I can sort of connect it and see it in the church is that we have, because of our purity culture, we just don't, when we talk about sex, we're usually talking about sex in these sort of degraded, bad, evil, sinful way, not it's a part of being human. God created us to have sex and enjoy sex, and actually is so beautiful. You can at times even create other humans if you want to in the process, and so what I see is less of particularly in speaking about having the Asian communities as part, or Asian folks as part of the church, is that we are exoticized in the fact, or in the role or way that oftentimes we become a token, right? Like the token Asian in the room who has all the experience and all the thoughts, and the thing you says is what every Asian person out there is like and thinks, right? It's the same way that we token, a Latinx person, or a Black folk person, or a Native American folk who comes to the church, or a Jewish, kin who comes and joins the church. You just sort of imagine you are everything of what I imagine you must entail for this group. And so I think that's sort of how I see it happen. I do want to share another story, though, and way by which we're also not addressing is Asian women and ordination in the church. So as you may notice, there are not a lot of Asian women who are ordained in the church. There are also not a lot of, even though there are a significant amount of women in the church, and even though the Asian community is growing in the Presbyterian church, we don't have a lot of ordained women, or if they are serving and they are a part of the church leadership in an ordained way, they are actually usually not the senior pastor, right? They're usually the youth pastor, the women's pastor,
the children's pastor.
Children's pastor, oftentimes the children's pastor, the associate pastor. And I want to just offer a name that there are two things I think going on. There's a lot of other things going on, but I want to name two in particular, is that within the Asian community, we have a lot of patriarchalism within our own communities. And so women are ready to be speaking up. Like I grew up in an Asian church, in specifically a Chinese American or Chinese immigrant church. The reason I'm not serving that church is because I'm a woman. I can't serve that church. I'm actually not allowed. And so it wasn't until I started serving a Presbyterian church that then I realized, oh, I can go to get ordained in this church. Do I want to do that? What does that look like? Am I called to it? And then decided to pursue it, but had to leave my former denomination because it wasn't even a thing. I didn't even know women pastors until I was an adult. And then decided to go to seminary. So there's one aspect where it's not even something that is encouraged. And as a result, even Asian churches within our denomination may or may not believe in women's ordination, even if they're part of the PCUSA. And so they are less likely to actually ordain and call a woman pastor to pastor their congregation. So that's one piece. The other piece of it is that if you're an Asian woman pursuing ordination and pursuing a call in a non-specifically Asian ethnic community church, they often see you because you're tokenized, and they see you as, and they are imagining you, Asian woman, as somehow either sexualized or somehow
submissive and passive.
Submissive. Thank you, Irene. Submissive, right? And someone who doesn't have a lot of drive and independent power. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes you're placed into these roles that you may not want. And I'll share my story, okay, publicly, which is that, so when I decided to pursue ordination for churches, I was constantly a finalist, but never the finalist. And in one situation, there was a church who had was considering me, and I was a finalist. I was not the finalist. They decided to go with a white middle-aged male, which is fine. He was great at what he says. He had a number of years more, sort of experience than I did. And I was like, that's awesome. You found your person. Great. What was interesting is that while we're going through this process, they're like, oh, we really want, somebody different. Specifically, we've had white men lead our church for decades. And so we're actually looking for a different kind of leadership. And I was like, okay, cool. Which is why they actually invited me to apply, invited me to the process. So when they decided to hire him, I was like, that's great. I'm glad you found your person. And then a number of months later, they came back and they said, hey, so we were wondering if you would consider the job again. And I said, well, what do you mean? What happened? And they said, well, he decided to turn down the position. And so we actually want to offer you the co-pastor position. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I thought this was a senior pastor job. And they said, no, well, it's a co-pastor job because we want you alongside another white man, and that we thought you could co-pastor together. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, we just felt like you're a mom with young kids and it would just be so hard on you. And I said, that is one of the most patronizing things I've ever heard. And I felt that way, to not be given agency and the trust to be seen as somebody who could actually, I applied for a job and I should be either given the opportunity to take it and decide whether or not I could handle it, or don't offer it to me. But that situation just helped me realize, and I'm just naming one of many, many situations like that. And so this is, and I'm sharing my story just, as one example. But the thing is, I actually meet regularly with other Asian American clergy in LA on a regular basis to talk about the challenges we face in ministry as an Asian American woman clergy person. And we have, and it's all of our stories are so similar. And this is a real thing that's happening in our denomination right now. So I just want to be able to name it and claim it and say, hey, this is us. You know, we're messy. But the beautiful thing is we are the church. So we can grow and we can change and we can transform. But we need to talk about it. We need to talk about the messy parts because it's time to start to grow up into the fullness of God's creation. So yeah, I would love to hear from Irene and others.
It's just, you know, I mean, so frustrating because like, I mean, my story too, you know, I decided not to go the ordination route because by the time I got to that space, I was starting to give my double fingers to the church and like all of the structures and I just didn't want to do the dance for any denomination. But, you know, a lot of my story is very much about having to deal with my gender identity as a woman leader, because coming in, I was definitely wanting to live, breathe, eat, die youth ministry. And there were not women in the Asian church context. I also served in an Asian immigrant church context, so patriarchal. And there were no women in youth ministry. So I was somewhat known because of the fact that if you were a woman, you were relegated to children's ministry, you were relegated to associate pastor and took care of administrative stuff because apparently that's all women are talented at, you know, and all those things. And so I've shared this on other places, my seminary experience. I went to a conservative seminary, but I didn't have issues with any of my professors who were predominantly white men. I had issues with my classmates, all of my Korean, you know, first gen, 1.5 gen, second gen, you know, classmates and colleagues who could not fathom me being in an MDiv program, right? A Master's of Divinity program. I loved, you know, whenever I would meet with them. So it was always, we'd have the lounge, right? The student lounge. And we'd be sitting around and be 7 of us just hanging out. And I've known some of these folks since they were 18 because we did college together and then moved into seminary together, right? And it would always be, okay, Pastor Joe, Pastor Dave, Pastor Paul, Pastor John, all these things. And if I was acknowledged, even though I'm sitting right there, the only woman amongst all these men, right? So I am definitely visible. It's not like that. But if I was acknowledged, then it was like, oh, and this is Irene. Even though I was a better preacher, I was better at exegeting the passage, even though I got better grades, you know, like all the things, but they would invite each other to speak at each other's camps and all of that, right? All the time. And so, you know, I have so many stories on the issue of needing to fight for my validity and my worth and my value being there in these spaces. And it was a really big struggle for me when I began to work in white spaces because I didn't really deal with the racial identity element of who I was outside of, you know, the occasional racist remark or whatever, because I was predominantly serving in a very Asian context. And so white spaces, in particular, white youth ministry spaces were my safe spaces because I would go. And again, because I hadn't done the work or really understood, I'd go and I'm the token person, but I felt special. I felt seen. I felt asked to be at the table. I was like, the chair was even pulled out for me and told that I was like so important and valued. And so here I was in this space, these white spaces where I thought, I could breathe and I felt so important and I felt so needed and all the things, right? And yet then when I started actually working in white spaces and I started to do the work that, you know, you see that chart, some of you, you know, there's this really famous graph that shows the process of women of color in the workplace where you enter in, you're given hope, you know, you're asked for your input and then you like go through the design and then you're like denied microaggression. Then like by the end, you're told that you're crazy and then like they exit out, right? And it's just the same. And every woman of color I know, they're like, oh my God, this is my whole career life, like working here, right? in these white spaces. And so, you know, once I started doing that, it was the thing that Ray is saying, like, you know, how then do we begin to intersect all of the issues that we're facing? And we're now, I feel like, as Asian women in particular, really talking about this lack of not belonging anywhere. There's no real element by which we feel that we belong in these certain spaces. And I think, you know, for me, both my Enneagram and my Myers-Briggs and my Strengths Finder, like all the things, I'm super autonomous and I'm super adaptable and like all these things. So I never really thought it was a problem because I could just adjust until I started really getting educated and then doing the work. And I was like, oh, this is a problem. Like all of these things, this is not good. I'm not actually being wanted for the value of who I am. I am being tokenized, and that's not a good thing. Like, and so now, like, to be discerning and actually, you know, when I go into these spaces, to understand what I'm pushing up against, you know, in white spaces that I know are very, many of us are very uncomfortable saying white supremacy, but it is a very colonized white supremacist mindset, you know, that you go in and to push up against that and not be the token voice and, you know, not to be told, okay, they like that I'm Asian, loud, unique, and yet make sure you contain that to what we are declaring should be, like, you know, the tone, Irene. You're crossing the line a little bit, you know, because again, the little graph of the workplace, right? You get comfortable, you're hired for your diversity and your wisdom and your insight and all the things, and then all of a sudden you're pushing too hard. You're like, wait, what? You want us to change? We're not okay with that. And what? Woman of color exits, right? And so, right. And once you realize you're being tokenized, once you realize, like, it's so interesting because for me, as an Asian woman, and maybe this is my own, I won't speak for, you know, other women, the aggression in the Asian church context was so in your face. It was so obvious, my not being desired there. You know, I had a supervisor who refused to, I was hired full-time. They had political issues. So I got demoted to half-time because I was still in seminary. And I was like, oh, I have 1 semester left. It's totally fine. And then my supervisor got hired. Does not believe women should be ordained. He would argue with us all the time. All the women staff. Women on staff, he would argue, because we have menstrual cycles, because all the people who were against women being ordained were women, because this, because that. I mean, so many things that he would not, he refused to give both me and the junior high pastor a full-time position. And I told the junior high pastor, he was complaining because he was like, I'm so sick of working 2 jobs and this and this and that. And I was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I'm the reason we're not getting full time. And so even though we had 110 students that we were overseeing, we were not full time. Like, I had to get a 30-hour job. And then obviously, even though I was half-time, it's still technically a 50-hour job, right? I'm just not getting paid for it and getting benefits. And I told the junior high pastor, you know, when I walk out the door, 2 weeks, you're going to get a full-time offer on the table. And he was like, no way. I left. I got told to leave because I was too, you know, rebellious. And at 2 weeks after I left, he got a full-time offer on the table, like clockwork. And so, you know, it's so aggressive that when I got into white spaces, it took me a long time because it was so microaggressive, the racialization, the tokenization, all these things, that you feel like you're getting valued when you're hired to be the tokenized, you know, quota fill. And I used to make jokes about it, right? Like, you know, my friend and I, she was my one Black friend, and it was me and all these speakers that were invited. It was like 20 speakers. And when she and I came into the room, I was like, the quota is here, let the fun begin, right? And, you know, you make jokes about it or whatever. And now, like, I'm realizing how harmful and detrimental that actually is, and what that actually means, all, again, the underbelly of all of that, which we don't talk about, because if we just talk about diversity on the near front, you know, then it all looks good, but your teeth are rotting behind that lovely white veneer, right? And they're not realizing it. And so I can go on about this for forever.
Yeah, and this is something that as y'all were talking, and it's not a different subject, but it's kind of connected. And being a part of the queer community, and us speaking about our AAPI siblings, and how I've seen similarities of what we're talking about, fetishization, specifically when it comes to Asian queer men and who identify as gay, and then many trans Asian people are seen as that too, and so the intersection of our queerness within all of this conversation too, and how, and even through like media and now RuPaul's Drag, like there's so many things like within gay culture that also perpetuates these narratives, not only for the queer community, but for people who identify as women. It is continual, and media. Like I just watched Rush Hour a couple weeks ago, and I watched that when I was young, and there's a scene where they're in Hong Kong and they go to a massage place, and then the curtains open and there's all these women, and it was like, take your pick. Like that, like just how things are depicted within media, and then experiencing that with in the queer community as well. It just got me thinking about that. Like there's so many ways in which these things are perpetuated. Yeah, I don't know if I don't know what I like. I'm not really asking a question, but I did just kind of came up to me when y'all were speaking, because I've talked to so many queer Asian people that have struggled, and it's developed into like the embodiment of trauma, like harm to them, like that kind of thing. It's just like a hyper sexualization or fetishization within that community. I just wanted to lift that up too, because I know that's very connected here as well. And that's not really a question, but you might want to respond. I don't know.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Lee. That is definitely something that I hear on a regular basis also from my queer Asian friends, in particular men, or those who identify as men or gay men. And I mean, and there's this other layer of Christianity and faith, right? So it's being, you know, as from what I'm hearing from my friends who are queer and are gay men, you know, they talk about sort of the idea that they're being fetishized. They feel like they're being fetishized when they go out in the dating pool. And then on top of that, there's another layering of fetishized and also expected to be, they, you know, people see them as submissive. And so they're supposed to play this role for the other person, as opposed to just being a human being who wants to love and wants to have a relationship and wants to have fun. Do you know what I mean? And then on top of that, you add the church, where, I mean, Irene and I have been talking about the challenge of being a woman called clergy person or minister in the church, and the fact that we cannot fit in the Asian community because we're women and we have been called into leadership roles. It's doubly or triply or quadruply this situation for our queer brothers and sisters and kin, who, by which there is no space for in a lot of our Asian communities because of the homophobia that is within, or the queerophobia that is within our communities. And then, of course, in white communities or non-Asian communities, there's a whole nother added layer of not being able to be seen as fully human, because we're seen first and foremost as being, well, you look Chinese, so therefore you must be Chinese, even though Irene's like, I'm not Chinese, you know? And so, you know, so there's a lot of spaces by which we cannot just fully be. And I think the answer, and that, I guess for me, then the question is, and as we move into the sort of the last 10 minutes, I'm curious what you all think about how we can move the church into a place, though, where we can just simply be. I mean, something I mentioned earlier, and as well in the last time we talked together, is the real intersectionality between the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, all of this violence that is not just in society, but actually is contained, if not sometimes preserved and held up within the church, right? Like what should we be doing in this season, in this time, to really be healing? And I want to name that, like, the question I have is really about healing as opposed to resistance. And the reason why is because resistance is important, because we're acknowledging there is something wrong and I am not okay with you being in my space like that, right? But then there's a secondary piece, right, to Christianity, which is about this sort of sense of healing, right? That there is a resurrection, that there is a somehow, Jesus came to be with and then to heal, right? And not that, and what does that mean? And when we talk about healing too, like what is a sin, the actual sin that we need healing from, that we can get to a space by which we've all been traumatized by racism. We've all been traumatized by sexism, whether we're a woman or a man or Asian or Black or white or Native American, whether like we are gay, straight, queer, however we identify. The thing is, like, we've all been challenged. We've all been affected. We've all been hurt, significantly hurt, to the point where my white male friends will say, like, I am nervous. I can't be me anymore. And it's like I'm also not going to be like, oh, you poor thing. But I'm going to say, I hear you, that you're also feeling stuck in the same exact SHIT that I'm in, and what are we going to do about it? And so anyway, I'm lifting this up to say, what kind of healing do we need in the church to be able to grow out of this? Because what we're doing right now hasn't been working, right? So I'm opening up this.
And I ask this question every day, and I fluctuate. 3 days, 4 days, I'll say 4 days out of the week. I'm so hopeful. And I feel like expectant, and optimistic that as people are growing and learning and more of these conversations are happening, I feel, in particular regards to the queer community, I feel like I was just banging up against a wall, like 15 years ago, right? Getting fired for wanting to advocate for the queer community. And like the fact that so many have been deciding and declaring and resisting, as Reverend Ray just said, to not tolerate that anymore and to stand for their dignity and their worth and their value. I'm so proud to see I'm not even just saying young generation, but like older generation, like the mass community saying no more, right? And I want to continually encourage folks. Like I said this on Twitter, I think a couple of months ago, like, I get it. It's exhausting. You're learning new things all the time. Like, if you want to say just in the history of humankind, we just are moving into Asian American Pacific Islander terminology. My mom, who came to the States in the 70s, still calls herself an Oriental, okay? And I have to teach her, you're not a rug, okay? Like, and she's like, tell me again why I can't say Oriental. Like, and she, I need to educate her. A friend of mine who's my age, the other day, she is an accountant. She does not talk about these issues on a daily basis. She's a number cruncher. She called herself Oriental. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, what are we going to do with this, right? And so I know that it's difficult because, and I say that story because as AAPI month started, there were hashtagging APA month, right? And I was like, okay, what's this? APA Heritage Month, which is really difficult hashtag, by the way, because of the notation system. Like, it's a difficult hashtag. I was like, we should not do this. But anyway, and I had to look it up because APA, we've been so focused on doing an AAPI call out, right? And so now we're shifting into Asian Pacific American, folks. And so like I understand the difficulty in the terminology shifting, even for me, who has been trying to educate and learn and advocate for the queer community. That whole process like has been such a journey. I'm learning every single day new terminologies, right? I mean, we keep adding letters to the LGBTQI so that we've now said infinity. Like, we're just at a plus, like, and so I get it that it's exhausting, but I just want to encourage folks, and especially those in the church, where I feel there's the most resistance and stubbornness for learning and shifting. And I don't know if it is because of the way you know, we have still in the church not been able to shift from modernity into post-modernity. And there's this very like absolute truthism that still undergirds everything by which what is biblical truth, what is true theological, exegetical like frameworks. You know, there is this lack of ability and willingness to hold with open hands things, which comes from a very Western European, very modern, you know, like mindset. And so I get it. And yet I just want to encourage folks, like, you're not going to blow up in smoke if you learn new terminologies. And I know it's tiring. The other day, my husband and I were so exhausted from quarantine, and we were like, we crack up all the time because our movie list, we're like, why is our movie list so mother effing serious? Like, it's, you know, 3 billboards, and then I Am Not Your Negro, and then this, and then this. And I'm just like, okay. So we were like, let's look up best rom-coms and just watch some stuff. So then I had never seen it and he had never seen it. So we chose The Proposal. Oh my God, I don't know if you've seen it, but there is this scene in there, and I'm just like, why is white supremacy attacking all the time, right? Like, I don't know if you're watching or listening have seen The Proposal. There's this horrendous scene where Betty White, bless Betty White, okay, and lovely Sandra Bullock, they do this scene where they're doing a ritual, a Native American ritual, and it's not good. And so I'm like, this is my face watching it the whole time. I was like, are we needing to turn this off? We're like 3/4 of the way in. Like, also, obviously they're gonna get together and all these things. But I was just like, oh my God, didn't even see that coming. It was just so out of left field. I was like, okay, so then they kind of indicated that she was like, you know, part Native, and I was like, so is that why they're justifying it? And also the whole that they own every store in the town, and I'm like, okay, colonizing all over the place, like, who actually owns this place? I mean, all the things. So I get it. It's so exhausting. I just want to watch a stupid rom-com and not have white supremacy like come at my face, okay? And it's hard. So I get that part, right? Like, even my friend Erna, she was you know, Kim Hackett, she was breaking down the MCU because she just saw the MCU. And I was like, I hate you. I love you, Erna. You're just like, don't ruin the MCU for me. But then, so I was like half listening to her rant, because it's also true. Her rant is so true on like the white supremacy elements in the whole MCU universe. And also at the same time, I'm like, but no, I don't want to ruin MCU, right? So I get that, you know, and it screws with your theology, and it's screwing with how we structure church and the way that we have. And I keep continually going back to this leadership book by this man named Heifetz, where he was saying people aren't afraid of change, they're afraid of loss, right? And so when we're continually talking about shifting, we are losing something, and we need to name that, and it's okay to lament the loss. Like, even though it's been 200 years, I suppose we're still lamenting the loss of the Confederate Army. So, okay, let's lament that, you know, and let's lament your stinking statues and all of those things. And like, let's name the loss of your culture and all of that as we are shifting and moving in. And maybe as a church, we just do a better job of that, instead of just resisting completely and saying, this is how it's always been. Why do we need to change? It's so messy, it's so difficult, it's so exhausting, it's so like, all, you know, and I don't like change. I don't like moving. I don't like, this bookshelf will be like looking like this for forever. I might add a painting over here somewhere, right? But after that, it's never going to change. I'm very intentional with my stuff, and so I don't like change. So I just, as I say these, like, part of me, as I do ministry to white folks going into these racialized conversations and stuff, you know, I get the resistance and the exhaustion, you know, but I just want to encourage everyone that even if you are losing a lot, we need to think of how much more we're gaining, as Reverend Ray was saying, because we all suffer under white supremacy. And yet, so when we are losing this, we're actually gaining so much more, right? And as Lee and Reverend Ray, as you were talking, I just kept thinking, like, how can we honor each other's story, like both collectively as a community, but as individuals, right? So, Reverend Ray and I are both Asian Americans. We're East Asian Americans, and we have similarities in our stories, and yet we're different, very different in our stories as well, right? And we need to honor that. And like, my story doesn't negate her story, and nor does it my story and her story negate Destiny's story, nor does it negate, Lee's story. And like, I just was on a podcast where we were talking about competition, and this idea where competition has been so, again, microaggressively the underside, the underbelly of white supremacy manifested, right? And we've like named it in this nice way, and beneficial or whatever. And yet we really need to talk about how when we play the oppression Olympics, it's a manifestation of white supremacy, right? We're all fighting in this scarcity model, and we need to stop doing that. And rather, let's say there's plenty of room and we have a lot of leaves in the table that we can keep extending the table out and enlarging the table, because the more stories we have, the more fulfilling it is, the more embodied we are collectively as a community of people, of human beings, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Irene. I wish we had another hour, because even though you were wrapping up all of that in a beautiful bow, like you just unpacked so many other things that I kind of want to touch on, but yeah.
We'll do it. We'll do this again. We'll have to do this again then. Yeah, part 3.
But we are at time, but I do want to give you maybe 30-second wrap up, message of hope, or ending words to our viewers who are watching. And we'll start with you, Irene, and then we'll end with Rev Ray.
I'll make it short because I feel like I just was on my soapbox. But just, like lean into change. I know it's really scary, and I know it's really uncomfortable, and I know it's really exhausting. And I just want you to know you're not alone, like in that exhaustion. We feel it, right? That we feel all of that, and constantly learning something new is tiring. And sometimes we just want to play our games and have fun and laugh and watch stupid rom-coms and all of those things. But lives are at stake, right? And we can't forget that. Like, I know, like, Palestine and Israel is really far away, and it doesn't seem like it affects us. Like, the Black Lives Matter movement to some folks is very far away. Like, it's not actually in our cities, and it's not in our neighborhoods. And so it doesn't seem like it affects us. And yet it completely does, and the violence against Asian Americans, as we've been addressing, seems like it has nothing to do with you. And yet it so actually does. And so this is what we mean when the Bible says we are all one body, right? If one part of the body suffers, then we all suffer. We need to take that quite literally, even in its figurative language, that if one element of humans suffer, especially now with globalization, it is all dominoes effects connected, right? And so we can't any longer, we're no longer in this, well, this is my village and my tribe, and therefore that has nothing to do over there with me and my people, right? We're especially now in today's society, we're absolutely all connected, economically, commercially, financially, communally, emotionally, everything, right? We see these things collectively affecting us in these ripple effects. And so even though you might as an individual feel like it doesn't have anything to do with you, pick up a book and be challenged and try to dig in and lean in and think, okay, how does this affect me? What does it mean that I'm learning about these issues, even though I can't see right away in what way it impacts me directly?
I think my last word is, I have a couple. I'll try and keep it short. I would say I definitely agree with Irene. I mean, change is here, but I would also say, because I'm in so many activist circles, to let go. God is leading the way. We don't need to carry the anxiety. We don't need to worry about it. God is leading, and we can see the resurrection happening. And the thing is, like, resurrection was not like easy, right? For Jesus, like, he had to die on the cross and then went somewhere for 3 days and then showed back up again, and it was really, really hard, both for Jesus as well as for the people. And I guess I'm saying for us, like, the thing is though, like, God had a plan, has a plan, and it's happening. And so we got to just let go into the death so that we can rise again. And to know that the most beautiful part about the resurrection, it's not just Jesus who rises from the dead, but we all rise from the dead. And so that's my good word that I can share with us all today and tonight. And thank you so much, Lee and Destiny, for this amazing show, podcast. And I'm really honored to know you both personally through this, as well as just be invited on again. What you all are doing and what we are creating together in these dialogues is so important. And I feel like we can't move forward, we can't resurrect unless we're having and being honest with one another about it. So thank you.
And thank y'all for just for everything and the honesty, and we will do this again, because I do think it's very important, and we may have another show that may focus more on the queer community, because I do think our AAPI queer siblings, and I'm gonna throw this out there to the queer community, that we can do better. And the way we're perpetuating these systems is awful. And we also need to be honest in that community. Just because we are a community that is oppressed, many of us have privilege, and many of us don't recognize that. And we're literally harming and hurting physically, emotionally, our siblings of color in our community. So I'm challenging the queer community out there, do better. So anyway, so thank y'all so much for being with us. We will be back next week with authors from Queering the Family, which is on Unbound, justiceunbound.org/Queering the Family. And we're just trying to change it up a little bit, how we think about the family. So we'll have that next week. And so until then, thank you, Ray and Irene, for being with us. And if we mentioned a link with Irene's piece, is up in the comments. All that's in there. So look for it. But in the meantime, we will see you next week, same time, same place. Bye, y'all.